Good morning. How is everybody doing? So I want to know who ordered this snow? Who ordered the second coming of winter? You guys did, right? You did. Oh my goodness. I woke up this morning, it was Snowmageddon. I'm like, what the heck? And then you see all your friends that are on March break in Florida on Facebook, and you're like, oh, and the sun and the sand. We'll get that eventually. We'll get there. Welcome back to day 2. Today is really exciting. You all have that very beautiful report sitting on your table there, hot off the presses. I have to say, just optically, it's one of the most beautiful reports I've ever seen. And, that is all the hard work that you guys have done across the country in that beautiful report. So I'm looking forward to flipping through and testing that academic muscle in my brain that I haven't used in a long time. I remember taking stats. I have a degree. A lot of people don't know. My mother, when I got selected for the national team in water polo, I really thought that I would be a millionaire water polo player, and I didn't think I needed my post-secondary education. And my mother's like, oh, no, you're going to, I don't care what you study, you're going to university. So, I had 2 overachieving older sisters that were already in university and all that kind of stuff. So I went to Carleton, played water polo at Carleton University here, and chose something that was near and dear to my heart, politics, and studied political science. And in order to graduate, I had to take stats, right? Just to get your degree. And I remember sitting there going, what am I doing in this class? How is stats ever going to play into my life, right? Yeah. Oh, those things if you could tell your 20-year-old self, right? You kind of smack some sense into them and, listen up, pay attention, do better. Yeah, that's one of those classes I wish I'd paid better attention to. I did pass, though, which I was pretty proud of. So we're here to start day 2. And really delve into some of the findings, and the writers are here, which is exciting. And but we want to start today off with a little recap video from yesterday that was hard work from all of the video capturing and some great photos you saw this morning. So let's get that video rolling. Is it ready? Is it cued? Someone once told me this kind of work, it's like the most beautiful piece of beadwork. And every bead on there is someone's effort and someone's, love and passion for their people to get that information so then it can be analyzed and then you can have results.
I like helping out my community, and I don't think they realize that just by answering this survey, what exactly they did for us.
Sometimes they went to an individual's house, sometimes we set up in a health center, sometimes people clicked through on their own, some people wanted to have someone beside them going through the survey with them.
I really believe this is really important. I truly do. This is critical to the future of our nations.
We have people from across the country who have joined us. All 10 of the regions that we work with today is really focused on the work that they've done over the last 5 years. But in the case of some of those people, really it's over 20 plus years.
The reason that I absolutely love doing this work, it's the stories. And that's all what First Nations teachings are about, is the stories.
The energy in the room was very inspiring and powerful.
What I perceived today from the participants is a feeling of unity and a feeling of hope and new drive to the future.
First Nations are exerting sovereignty through this work. We, the FNIGC, and many of our partners across the country are contacted frequently by mainstream organizations, international organizations, Indigenous peoples internationally, to share what we know about exerting sovereignty through data sovereignty. And so it's incredibly exciting.
We're at a time now, 20 years later, since the inception of RHS, we need to take it a step further. We need to begin to start creating our own stories within that data set and to really revamp that survey so that it'll actually identify what our needs and priorities are.
Time and time again, people step up to participate in the mechanisms, the systems, the surveys, the celebrations that need to take place so that we can gather the information that needs to be gathered and put it to use.
What great work this has already done, but what great work there is that lies ahead.
Oh, that was awesome. Nice job. Well, to get the party started and get into this report, I'd like to invite Executive Director of FNIGC, Jonathan Dewar, back to the stage.
Thank you, Juanique. It's actually very tough to follow that video because I think the kinds of things that we heard from people, a little too much of me perhaps, but the kinds of things we heard from the rest of you really did capture the spirit of yesterday and actually captures a lot of what I was going to say this morning. So I just want to start this morning by acknowledging again, as we did yesterday, that we are on unceded Algonquin territory. It's both a traditional territory and it's a contemporary territory, and it's that latter piece that we always have to remember when we are in places across this land that we call Canada, that we are talking about traditional territories, yes, but also the expression, the contemporaneous expression of what it means to be First Nations in this country, and I think that that's really essential. Our elder, Claudette Commanda, will be joining us again later this morning, and of course she'll be here to help us close in a good way. She helped us start in a good way yesterday, and I'm really grateful for that, and hopefully the snow does not impede her or anyone else's ability to be with us today. I know it may impede some of you leaving our nice city, in which case we'll be very pleased to have you for another day. And I'd encourage you to visit us if you can. Our national office is just a few blocks away. So if you're stuck here, don't despair. We'd love to see you. I was overwhelmed by yesterday. It was one of the highlights of my year, really one of the highlights of my career, in fact. The data collectors panel in particular blew me away. I think I heard from many of you that it too was a highlight for you. I said to a number of people I spoke with after the day was done, as we were gathering upstairs to socialize, I said to a number of people that that kind of panel was precisely what many of us need to hear when we work at the national level. It is absolutely what our federal funders need to hear. It is absolutely what academics and scholars who don't work as closely to the ground, to the front lines, to the grassroots that many of you do. It is absolutely what they have to hear. There is no research in First Nations country that is not deeply personal, that is not first and foremost about relationship. There is no way to collect, whether qualitative or quantitative data, in community without people being people, exerting the sovereignty of what it means to be a First Nations person, practicing culture by being with people from their communities, and for those people who cross communities, because that's the approach that was chosen in that region. People are exerting sovereignty. They're bringing pieces of themselves. They're following protocols, introducing themselves, sharing stories. It's reciprocal. It is about relationship. So I think yesterday we heard over and over again how essential it is for people to be well-resourced to do this work, and we're not quite there yet. You do the work at such a high level. we need to ensure that we're doing it even better as we go forward. And we certainly heard that yesterday, and we heard it in the video just now, that ahead of us are many more opportunities to continue this work, and we will do better. You have raised the bar continuously, year after year, for 20 plus years with the RHS, and I know that's what we're going to do in the years to come. So, we, the national team, designed this conference with a lot of input from regions, of course, but we designed this conference to be about you. And that's why day one was focused on the work that regions do, the work that people in communities within those regions do to make the surveys possible. There is no national without what you do within the regions, without what you do in communities. So the fact that we are here on day two to launch this national report, the national level data, is of course significant. It's something we're very, very proud of. I'm extremely proud of the team that I work with at the national office of FNIGC. But we cannot do this work without you. And so this conference remains about you, even here on day two as we talk about the national data. And I hope that you see that throughout this report and everything that is said about it moving forward. So, I promised my team that I would stick to the notes to a degree. I haven't yet, but I want to make sure that we acknowledge the people who've done this work. So, as I said yesterday, I didn't do this work. I'm still the new guy. I'm a whole day older, so maybe I have a lot more to say. I certainly do have a lot more to say after hearing you yesterday. But as the person who is newest to this work in some ways, it really is a privilege to be able to be up here and to talk about this work, because I was somebody who looked at this work from the outside. I used this work. I used this work in my work with residential school survivors. I used this work with national Indigenous organizations, particularly the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. I used this work in my research as a scholar. This material, this work that you do is absolutely essential. And so it really is a privilege for me to be able to be up here and to help lead the celebrations of the work that you've done. Thousands of people worked on the surveys, and they are the driving force behind this national report. I would love to be able to acknowledge the thousands of people by name. We'd have to take a whole day to do that. But I hope that you feel that you are captured in the way that we do want to acknowledge you. Survey coordination at the national level, survey coordination in the regions, obviously management at the national level and in the regions. All of that development work was done by hundreds of people. And we acknowledge that frequently as we do the work at the national level, that we could not be where we are if not for you. I mentioned how proud I am of the staff at the national office. I'm getting to know many of you in the regions. Yesterday couldn't be better for me as a way to get to know some of you who I haven't had an opportunity to meet yet. The passion that you displayed, the dedication, the way that you embrace responsibility, accountability, reciprocity is awe-inspiring. It really is. And so I thank you for that. Most important, something I said yesterday briefly, something many of you said, most importantly, we have to acknowledge, we have to say thank you, miigwech, merci, to the First Nations people in community who completed these surveys. Close to 24,000 people took the time to do this. You know these people personally. We heard those stories yesterday. 24,000 people, on top of everything else that is going on in people's lives and in communities, on top of everything that we ask communities to do. People keep coming back and stepping up to do this work because they know it's important. Some of them, of course, have to be encouraged to embrace that, and that's the work that you described yesterday, helping people understand how important it is to do this work as a survey respondent. So, There are no words to express how thankful I am, how thankful I know all of you are for the effort that people put in to complete these very long surveys. In some cases, tools that seem very foreign to people in community. They put their trust in you that you have translated what we are asking them, sometimes literally into Indigenous language, First Nations languages, but more broadly speaking, translating what they need to understand, the concepts they need to understand as they complete this work. That is the work that you've done, but much more importantly, they need to trust you, and our success means you were successful in being respectful, in being true, and engendering that trust. And so we are incredibly thankful for the effort that you've made in that regard. Survey work is obviously the bread and butter of FNIGC. The RHS, a 5-year cycle. There's a significant amount of money that comes to the national office, a significant amount of money that goes out to the regions to complete this work. It is our bread and butter. We also, of course, we literally hold the trademark for OCAP, something that I think virtually everyone yesterday acknowledged. And this, too, is the work that we, the national office, will do with you over the coming years to ensure that people know what OCAP is and embrace it in their hearts, as you have. So trust, we talk about, 20 plus years ago, when First Nations leadership in particular, thought leaders, of course, elders, many people in the health field, leaders in the health field, when people began to conceptualize the need for the RHS, that was really coupled with the need to develop and express what OCAP means and how it can be practiced. You set the bar, as I said yesterday, you set the bar very, very high. Some of our partners have struggled more than others to meet you at that bar. The patience that you've shown, the leadership that you've shown in continuing those conversations and ensuring that our partners hear us, understand us, and come to agreement, not always precisely when we want or how we want, but eventually, obviously, the RHS is an indication of levels of success in that regard. The fact that you have shown these strengths over so many years and continue to do so, I think is something else that we need to celebrate. But we have to do better, as we heard yesterday. You have continued to refine the RHS over 20 years. And we collectively will continue to refine it as we move forward. And that's exciting work for us at the national level. The RHS is still a survey like no other, by First Nations, for First Nations. The diversity across First Nations in Canada, we certainly saw it reflected yesterday. We heard it reflected in the languages used. That diversity will always make what we do challenging, but it's also one of the things that we celebrate the most. And I know the refinements that you will help lead on RHS moving forward will be profound, and I'm very thankful for that. So, you have a large report in front of you. It's the first of 2 volumes. We've done that strategically, in part because it gave us something that we could start with today at the conference, and we are expecting that the second volume will be out in a few months. I think we're targeting July. Many of you, of course, in regions will also be bringing together your reports. And so in a matter of months, we will have one of the best portals into health and well-being for First Nations across the country than we've ever had. Again, keeping in mind that we can do better. We can make refinements that will get even better in the future. But in front of us today and in the coming months will be the best opportunity to raise that bar even further with our federal partners and with partners across many sectors across the country. Today, we are also, we've gone online with our FNIGC data tool. I believe there are over 82 of the published charts and graphs on that data tool. So it's not just the report in front of you, it's also that material in the data tool. Anytime you collect information and you interpret that information, it is limited to the interpretation in front of you. And so there is a need, an ongoing need, to go from our report, to go from the material in those data tool, in the data tool online, and to continue to dig deep, to explore appropriately from your perspectives, cultural, political, what have you, and to continue this work. And so this is a first, yes, significant step, but it is a first step towards that ongoing work. Today, we have with us many of the authors from the chapters in Volume 1. And Volume 1, as you'll see in front of you, includes a chapter that introduces the RHS, so it includes a background, methodology, a cultural framework for the work. Chapter 2 is on demographics. Chapter 3 is chronic health conditions. Chapter 4, mental health and substance use. Chapter 5, oral health. Chapter 6, Indian residential schools. I'm very excited to hear from the authors. I know that you will listen with rapt attention as you did yesterday. I thank you again for the patience that you showed yesterday, the support you showed for your colleagues across the country. I do a lot of these conferences, and rarely does a room stay full throughout the day. And yesterday, we had a full room. We had a full room. We had exciting conversations in the hallway. In the bathroom, I overheard a few. My apologies. In the elevator, and of course at our reception last night. So, I'm very excited to be able to be a small part of the work that you do, to be able to hold up today the work of my colleagues in the national office, the work of our colleagues in the regions, of course, our experts who began that interpretive work that we must do. Moving forward, of course, with the second volume, we'll have, again, an introduction in that volume. And then we will have focuses on language and culture, food security, healthcare access, physical activities, and personal and community wellness. So that's something for you to look forward to. We won't be able to do this with you at a conference in a matter of months, but we will see you out there in the world, in communities, in regions, at conferences like this. We will see you. We will see each other, and we'll have more opportunities to talk about the work and the way we've supported each other in that work. I did say I would stick to the notes, and let me just acknowledge this. So all of Volume 1's results will be presented today, with the exception of personal and community wellness. Unfortunately, the writer could not be present. Selected results from Volume 2 will also be discussed today by the authors as a sneak peek to the next volume. Oh, Brad's gone. He would be so proud that oh, there he is. So proud that I stuck to the notes. Thank you. Thank you. So, again, I'm going to close by saying thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for giving of your time, because most of you I'm very impressed with this, especially with my board of the FNIGC. Many of you wear dozens of different hats. The fact that you can keep track of those things impresses me, but the fact that you are willing to take on that level of responsibility in your communities and in your regions, politically and culturally and within families, it really is a testament to, as I said yesterday, the strength of this work. It's not just that it's unique. Yes, it is. We celebrate that. But it is quality work. The reason people from the outside look at the RHS and the other work we do together and identify it as quality work is because of the way you do that work. And we do things a little bit differently than folks in the mainstream. And they are learning that our ways are best practices, full stop. We need to continue that work. We may have to be very patient with some of our partners, as we have been for decades, but we are getting there. So I'll close by saying thank you, miigwech, merci to all of you. I have had a chance to meet many of you. I look forward to meeting more of you. I want to acknowledge my colleagues in the national office. It's a fantastic team. I know many of you know them personally now because we work quite closely together. I am privileged to work with them. Regional partner organizations and the people who work in those organizations, I'm getting to know you. I hear wonderful things from your colleagues across the country about you and from my colleagues in the national office, and I say thank you to you. Regional coordinators, of course, are the driving force of this work. Data analysts, administrators of various sorts, field workers, as we heard yesterday, First Nations leadership, community staff, many committees, many consultants, consultants who work with us, who uphold OCAP. Consultant isn't a bad word anymore because when folks out there embrace what we have been teaching people, it can be a really wonderful thing. And so I thank the many consultants who worked with us on this, First Nations and non-First Nations. And ultimately, this is a demonstration of coast to coast to coast First Nations collaboration in the spirit of the principles of OCAP. It is a demonstration of sovereignty. It is a demonstration of your commitment to teachings from your cultural perspectives. Similar though they may be sometimes, different though they may be other times, it is a testament to the way you hold those things in your heart and the way you express them to the world. And I will repeat, others are picking up this work and looking at it as an indication of how this kind of work, research, how data collection can be done better. You are truly leading, and I'm very pleased to be with you and to follow your lead. So thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Just before we get started with our first presentation, we have some visitors in the room that I would like to introduce because I think they've come far and wide. They've heard about the great work and the great report being presented today. So I think they're coming here to just to take in what's happening. They are all the way from Aotearoa. We have Aroa Watine. She's from the Ngani Tahoe tribe, and she's an Indigenous language revitalization specialist. And we have Dr. Rongo Watere. He is here from Aotearoa as well. He is also, he's working actually in education and trying to help start a first all-Indigenous university in Ontario, supporting that work. And then we have Mike Graham, who is the Wakahata tribe, I'm sorry, and he's from Aotearoa, and he's also an Indigenous language revitalization specialist. So welcome them to the plenary. Thank you very much for coming. So our first speaker is going to speak about residential schools, and Amy Bombay is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and at the School of Nursing at Dalhousie University. She's a member of the Rainy River First Nations, and she has an incredible resume, but her research, which we've heard so many people talk about here, and especially when you come from the community, focus generally on the issues related to the health and well-being of Indigenous people. And her projects are driven by the needs and the priorities of Indigenous communities and organizations. And this is why, my sisters are both in different areas of research, and it's why it's so important that we create these researchers out of our communities, because they have the ear to the ground. And I can't wait to hear what Amy Bombay has to say. So welcome to the stage. There she is.
Okay, I'm happy to be here. I'd like to start by thanking FNIGC and all of the workers in the regions, the people who are out there collecting the data. Just to echo what John said, that's where all the real work happens, and so thank you. So I'm happy to be speaking first today. Because I get really nervous about public speaking, and I'm happy to get it over with, but also because, I think it's really important that as we hear some of this data today, hearing about both some negative things and hearing about some health issues that we need to address, but also we'll be hearing about some positive things. But I think it's really when we're hearing about the negative things and some of the things that we really need to work on, it's important to think about the root causes of these issues, which is colonization. And Indian residential schools was one major aspect of colonization that continues to contribute to the long-term health issues and health inequities that we continue to see today. And I think it's also important that we continue to monitor these long-term impacts so we can continue to determine the ongoing healing needs in our communities. I think we still have a lot of healing to do, and I think it's important that we show that to government. And also to help inform our approaches to healing, to emphasize that it does need to be rooted in culture and in community. So with that said, I'll jump right into it. So our chapter kind of really sought to address 4 main research questions. The first being just to assess the proportion of First Nations peoples directly affected and or intergenerationally affected, so the survivors and those who had parents and grandparents who attended. We also wanted to assess the experiences of residential school survivors who are alive today. We wanted to look at the long-term impacts of residential school attendance on those who attended, so on survivors. And we also wanted to look at the intergenerational impacts of residential schools on those who had parents and or grandparents who attended. So first, looking at just the proportion of people that were affected by residential schools. So this is looking at the adult sample and looking at the proportion of adults who attended residential school themselves. And it's 14.9% of the adult population. And this is only about 5% higher than in 2002 and 2003. So again, really emphasizing the continued healing needs and the large proportion of our First Nations population that actually attended residential school and is still in need of continued healing. When we look at it by age group, we see most survivors are ages 60 and older, which is, I think, what we would expect. But then I think it's also important to recognize that we have survivors who are in younger age groups as well, and again, who are in need of healing. This is looking at data from the adult, youth, and the child samples, and just looking at the proportion of the population who had a parent who attended and the proportion who had a grandparent who attended. And so they could answer yes to both of these. So these aren't mutually exclusive categories. So if we just look at the adult sample, we can see that just under 1/2, 48.6%, had a parent who attended, and just over 1/2, 54.3%, had at least one grandparent who attended. As expected in the youth and the child samples, the proportions with a parent who attended residential school is much lower compared to the adult sample, less than 20%. But we see that almost 2/3 of children and youth had at least one grandparent who went to residential school. So we also decided to kind of categorize people into mutually exclusive categories, depending on whether they attended residential schools and whether their parent and or grandparents attended. So we have those in the blue, represented by the blue bars in each sample, are the people who were not directly or intergenerationally affected. They may have had other relatives who were affected, but their parents and grandparents did not attend. And then we categorized those who had at least one grandparent who attended, but who had no parents who attended, into one category. Those who had at least one parent who attended, and they possibly could have also had a grandparent who attended, so we're not really accounting for that potentially multiple generations. And then we compared those to survivors in the adult sample. And so if we're just looking at the proportions, we can see in the adult sample that only about 28.1% of the adult sample were not affected by residential schools. About 18.7 had a grandparent who attended, but no parent. About 36.4% had at least one parent who attended, and they may also have had a grandparent who attended as well. And then about 16.8% reported attending residential school, and that's just a little different than that 14.9% that I reported earlier, just because in this there were more missing data when we did it according to mutually exclusive categories. So that's why that's a bit different. And then in the youth sample, again, it's about a third. It's only about a third of youth who did not have a parent or a grandparent who attended, and in the child sample, it's about 37.7. So we're looking at the majority of the First Nations population that's either been directly or intergenerationally affected by residential schools, I think, which is an important point to make, because I think it's thought of maybe in the mainstream that, this is something that only affected a small proportion. And I think understanding that has really implications for emphasizing the continued healing needs. In this graph, we recalculated it and looked at the people who were directly attended and or had a parent or grandparent who attended. So again, if we look at just at the total adult sample, we see that 74% were affected by residential schools directly or intergenerationally. And again, if we look at different age groups, it's across all age groups. So next, we wanted to look at some of the experiences of residential school survivors. So here we're just looking at those who attended residential school. And we just wanted to look at how long did survivors who are alive today spend at residential school. And we see that in the younger age groups, they were more likely to only spend 1 to 2 years, whereas compared if we looked at the 55 and older age group, we see they were much more likely to spend 5 years or more there. So, I think that older age group would be at more risk just because of the tendency to spend more time in residential school. These were various experiences that were asked of survivors. They were asked if they perceived negative impacts associated with any of these potential experiences. And as you can see, large proportions experienced a number of different adversities while attending residential school. This is significant because research in the mainstream population shows that the greater number of different types of adversities that people are exposed to throughout their childhood, the greater the risk for negative outcomes. So residential school survivors, this is really showing how they were exposed to a number of various types of adversities while they were attending. So now to really look at the long-term impacts on survivors and on those who had a parent or grandparent who attended. So, and I generally just picked a range of various health outcomes to show the range across mental and physical and other determinants of health and how residential schools impacted them. So first, we just looked at self-rated general health. And so mostly I'm comparing those who were affected by residential schools to those who were not affected. And if we look at the adult sample, we can see that those with at least one grandparent did not differ from those who were not affected in their ratings and their likelihood to rate their general health as good, very good, or excellent. That said, those with a parent who attended and survivors were significantly less likely to report good, very good, or excellent health. Likewise, if we look at the youth and child samples, we see no differences among those with a grandparent who attended, but we see that those with at least one parent who attended residential school, so those gray bars, differed significantly from in their ratings of their general health compared to those not affected. So we also looked at self-rated mental health, so whether people reported good, very good, or excellent health versus fair or poor health. And in the adult sample, again, we didn't see differences with those who just had a grandparent who attended, but those who had a parent who attended were at risk, and survivors were also were less likely to report these positive self-rated mental health. In the youth sample, it's a little bit different because we see that those with a parent who attended are less likely to report positive health, but also those with a grandparent were also less likely to rate their mental health as positive. Likewise, looking at the the proportion of people who reported suicidal thoughts in their lifetime, we see significant differences in the adult sample. In this case, all of those affected by residential schools were more likely to report suicidal thoughts compared to those not affected. If we look at the youth sample, you did not see that increased risk among those with only a grandparent, but we did see a significantly higher risk among those youth with at least one parent who attended. So 25% of youth with at least one parent who attended reported such thoughts, compared to only 11.5% of youth who were not affected in this way. So we looked at substance use as well. We looked at binge drinking in the past year. Cannabis use in the past year, and use of other non-prescription drugs, which is, I think, a list of various types. And so if they used any, we counted them as using other types. And again, we compared those not affected to those who with at least one grandparent, one parent who attended, and survivors. And so what we find here, which was consistent with previous RHS data, is that survivors are not more likely to report more use of these substances compared to those not affected. So they seem to be maybe finding some other coping strategies to deal with some of their distress. Yet when we look at those with a parent and with a grandparent who attended, they were more likely to report using these substances compared to those not affected by residential school. And this is just the same analyses in the youth data. And again, we see greater risk for binge drinking, cannabis use, and use of other non-prescription drugs among those with a parent or grandparent attended compared to those not affected by residential school. So in relation to looking at use of prescription opioids in the past year, whether or not they had been prescribed to them or not, in contrast to the previous graph we looked at, looking at the other substances, in this case, survivors were more likely to report using prescription opioids compared to those not affected, as were those who had a parent who attended. So that was a little bit of a different pattern compared to the use of other types of substances. In youth, we did not see a greater risk in those with a grandparent who attended, but we did see a greater risk in those with a parent who attended. Next, we looked at smoking, and again, in the adult sample and in the youth sample, we see that those with at least one grandparent and with at least one parent who attended were more likely to report current smoking compared to those not affected. So again, this is also now affecting health behaviors and coping strategies as well. There were some really interesting, I think, positive findings suggesting that those affected by residential schools are very aware of the need for healing, or maybe really trying to address those things intergenerationally. This was a really interesting finding looking at breastfeeding. In the child sample, they were asked whether the child was ever breastfed during infancy, and we found that those with at least one grandparent and one parent who attended were more likely to report breastfeeding, which is obviously associated with a number of positive health outcomes. We're not really sure why that might be the case, but I think that's something to look at further and to find ways to further promote such positive behaviors and find out what's driving that. We also wanted to look at the proportion of youth and children who reported living with at least one of their biological parents. As it has been suggested that the residential school system has really has led to the continued removal of children from their parents, both through the child welfare system and in affecting family relations. And so we found that in the youth sample, those with at least one parent who went to residential school were less likely to live with at least one of their biological parents compared to those not affected, although we didn't see that same difference in the child sample, which is a good thing and suggesting maybe that's getting better. We looked at First Nations language ability and the proportion of adults, children, and youth who reported their abilities to speak their First Nations language at an intermediate or fluent level. And in the adult sample, we found that while residential school survivors were more likely to report being able to speak their First Nations languages at these levels. Those with a parent or grandparent who attended were less likely. So survivors were more likely, but for whatever reason, they didn't seem to pass that on to their children. So I think this is also something that's worth following up on. That said, the positive news is that when we look at the youth sample, we actually see there's no significant differences between those affected and not, with the exception that youth with a parent who went to residential school are actually more likely to be able to speak their language. So again, this suggests that there's potential generational differences and some positive changes in towards relearning languages and re-engaging with culture. We also looked at participation in cultural events and those who said they participated in community cultural events sometimes or almost always versus less frequently. And again, this is positive. We see that in adults, we see that survivors were most likely to report participating in such cultural events. I think that's really in line with research that was done by the Healing Foundation, suggesting that many survivors turn to their culture as a way to heal. And so I think that this is kind of probably reflecting that. And again, those with at least one parent who attended were also more likely to report participating in these events. Again, with the youth and child, those with one parent who attended and one parent were also more likely to report greater participation in these events. And so this could reflect a lot of different things, just their kind of maybe an increased need to re-engage, an increased need to healing. But I think that's some positive demonstrations of the healing that's happening. Likewise, we looked at feelings of belonging in their home community. And in the adult sample, there were no differences associated whether they had a parent or grandparent who attended. But again, survivors reported were more likely to feel that they felt like they were very or somewhat strong feelings of belonging in their community. And in youth, those with one grandparent and one parent who attended, again, were more likely to report these positive feelings of belonging. And then lastly, we also wanted to look at an important determinant of health, food insecurity. And we wanted to look at how residential school attendance was associated with the risk of being classified into a severely food insecure household. And we did find that survivors and those with a parent who attended and those with a grandparent who attended were more likely to be categorized into a household that is categorized as severely food insecure. So this is, showing, there's probably multiple determinants of health that are contributing to some of the decreased health among those affected by residential schools. So I think there's a lot of pathways we can look to for healing as well. So that was it for sharing the kind of snippets from our chapter, and I hope that it can be used to kind of spur more research and to help inform and emphasize the need for further healing in First Nations communities. Thanks.
I'm going to encourage, I know that we were asking people to keep their presentation 20 minutes, but I hope there's questions. You get your chance to have these amazing writers and people who kind of got to analyze all this data. Does anybody have any questions for Amy? Just sorry to chase you back to the stage, but I'll be doing this to every single presenter, so get your question hats on and start thinking about that.
Hi. I was curious about the prescription opioid use. Did you guys control for age and chronic illness in that?
Yeah, so it should be emphasized that these are all just bivariate statistics. And so definitely age is going to probably, might influence a lot of these relationships that we're looking at, as well as other factors. So that's why I really encourage further analyses to be done where we control, for a lot of different variables at the same time and really see what's contributing to some of these outcomes.
We have families who have grandparents, parents, uncles, aunties, siblings attend. So I'm just curious to see how you build the categories so that I could possibly do a similar analysis as you.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that there's a lot of different ways you could categorize things to look at. The impacts of residential schools, like the way we did it, we categorized it into, and it's described in the report as well, but we categorized survivors just as survivors, so we did not take into account their potential intergenerational effects in these relationships, which absolutely, if you were to compare maybe survivors who had a parent who attended and not, you might very likely see differences. But so we just compared survivors to those with a parent who attended. They might also have had a grandparent who attended, so we didn't take into account that potential cumulative effect, which some of our research has actually shown does exist, that the more generations in your family that attended, the greater the risk. So we're not necessarily capturing that. And then those who had a grandparent who attended only had a grandparent attend. And those in the not affected category did not attend, did not have a parent who attended, did not have a grandparent who attended, but they may have had aunties and uncles who attended, and we didn't measure that in these analyses either, which also might have some impacts. So there's many more analyses that could be done to really try to tease out how these long-term impacts, and how having more generations, having a mother versus a father, for example, and all of these other things, I think we still need to understand.
I have a mic here, so if you don't want to get up, I'm willing to run to you. Any other questions? Awesome.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was just wondering why, looking through the charts and stuff in your writing, you didn't use the word trauma. Just one short and simple question. Why don't you use that word? I'm just interested why.
That's interesting. I didn't, to be honest, notice I didn't use the word trauma. I think I use stress and adversity a lot. I think that's all generally kind of interchangeable. Stress kind of captures trauma. And I think absolutely, most survivors certainly went through trauma. And I think that, those categories of childhood adversity is really kind of capturing. There's sexual abuse listed there. That's certainly trauma, no matter what. Absolutely. Yeah, so maybe we should have emphasized that a bit more, but I think it still comes out that it was as stressful and trauma and adversities, and that's really what we're looking at. Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, from your research and the other research that you've done, what question would you recommend adding for the RHS 4 round on residential schools?
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to look at adding a question asking about if people have been affected by the child welfare system, and looking at if there's a link between being affected by residential schools and then subsequently being affected by the child welfare system. And we actually did a study with a non-representative sample where we just collected our own data that showed that. But again, that's what is so powerful about this data, is that it's a national representative sample, and so showing that link would be even more powerful, and I wouldn't be criticized it for all these limitations of my study that I ran. It would be really, I think, a powerful thing to say. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay.
Yeah, good morning. Just thank you for your presentation. Just listening here. I'm one of the leaders from up north, Northwest Territories, and I guess just listening to all the things there. One of the things we find in our community as a result of residential school is, I call it traditional land deficit disorder, where you've lost connection with the land. So there's a lot of programs out there that language revival, culture, the music, all that kind of stuff. I was just wondering if you had anything any of that work done through this residential school?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think maybe that right now the items in the RHS don't ask about connection to land. You know, it asks about other aspects of connection, engagement with culture, and different aspects of cultural identity. But I think that's one aspect that maybe we don't have a lot of information about, just because it hasn't been measured or focused on enough in research. So I think that's another maybe aspect, you know, question that could be added in future surveys. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else with one last question? All right, thank you so much, Amy.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll be running around with that later because I know not everybody wants to stand up behind a mic, so we'll come to you, no problem. I would like to invite our next presenter up. She's here to present on another portion of the report. She wrote on culture and language. Angela Mashford-Pringle, Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle, is an assistant professor and associate director for the Joaquin Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health and the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. She's an urban Algonquin woman from Temiskaming First Nations in northern Quebec, whose research is at the intersection of Indigenous health and education. Please welcome Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle.
Kwekwe, Tanzi, Bozo, Aloha, Bonjour. I just want to say hello to everybody as best I can in as many languages as I can. As you'll see, I've been tasked with trying to learn more languages, at least how to say hello. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territories of my ancestors and that I'm here back in Algonquin territory. How nice it is to be here. And I want to acknowledge the fact that, so Monique tried really hard. It's Wakabanis Bryce. That I'm here on behalf of my institute as well as for myself. Wakabanis Bryce is a relatively new institute, and we're striving to ensure that we can start to look at things like culture and language within the research that we do. So when I started to look at this is not new to me. I often look at culture and language. In fact, last year I was working with First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Social Services, Health and Social Services Commission, and looking at the RHS. And culture and language played a big factor in that as well. What we don't talk about often is that connection to land. And I think that it's very important that we bring that connection back. That connection is part of why we have culture, because what I've been taught is that our culture and our languages came from the land, and that we need to connect to that piece where we had those languages. Those languages came from our interactions with the land. And so part of what I was writing about when I looked at the variables was about how our languages and our culture came about. And I say culture, but it should be cultures. So in fact, our traditional teachings tell us that what we see and what we know comes from our interactions with the plants, the animals, the land, people. It comes from creation. It doesn't come from just nowhere. It comes from our being. So we have to get back to that, and we have to examine that when we start to look at culture and language and what it means. So First Nations languages, they transmit our culture. So when you start to learn your language at a younger age, the way you view the world comes across by your knowledge. So every time you learn another language, you see the world in a different way. And so First Nations languages have very different meanings. We have places where we don't have the same kind of words as English, French, or other westernized languages. And so there's this different connotation about how we see the world and what we're doing within the world. And I really, really liked the way that Elder Jim Dumont said this inside of the National Native Addictions Partnership Foundation. He describes how culture and language is connected to wellness. And he says, expressed through a sense of balance of spirit, emotion, mind, and body, central to wellness is belief in one's connection to language, land, beings of creation, and ancestry, supported by a caring family environment, with an Indigenous worldview being rooted in family, community, and within creation as extended family is the foundation of belonging and relationships. Physical well-being is that way of behaving and doing that actually actualizes the intention and desire of the spirit in the world. This and the knowledge that spirit has something to do in the world generates a sense of purpose, conscious of being part of something that is much greater than we are as individuals. And I think that's really important when I started to look at the actual statistics for the RHS this time, is looking at how we connect all those pieces. What does culture and language mean? Because when we don't look at that, we often miss pieces. So while I looked at it this way, I was looking at the inter and intra-generational traumas. I was looking at how the Indian Act and the amendments to the Indian Act, residential schools, the 60 scoop, the millennial scoop, the PASS system, one that's not a chapter, but I hope that FNIGC does make into a chapter, is the effects of the Indian hospitals, overrepresentation in prisons that are the pipeline from schools to prisons, and the broken treaties. So to me, that's part of it. I think that we need some more questions about systemic racism in the RHS. It would have been nice to look at that and how it plays into our use of culture and language, but it's not there, but it's something that I think would be important for future use. So looking at all of these things and thinking about the statistics, I was also thinking of what Truth and Reconciliation Commission came across. And so if you read number 14, it says the preservation, revitalization, and strengthening of Aboriginal languages and cultures are best managed by Aboriginal people and communities. I think that's what we're doing with the RHS. That's one of the first steps, because we can see where the languages are getting stronger. We can see where the cultures are getting stronger. And we'll be able to, in the future, take this and be able to move it forward. So this was my attempt at trying to learn a whole bunch of languages. I went online and asked as many people as I could to give me their hello in their own languages. So I've been tasked by a friend of mine who's a language revitalization specialist to learn every one of those properly. Sounds easy, right? How many do you know? There's lots there. And I think that there's tons more that I could have put in there that aren't in there. And we know that we only have about 50 to 60 languages in Canada that are actually having enough speakers to keep them vibrant and alive for the next 20 years. So to ensure that some of the languages that aren't as vibrant still have speakers, how do we get there? So that was one of the things I was looking at when I started to look at the importance of learning a First Nations language, what knowledge of the First Nations language people had, so understanding, speaking, reading, and writing, and what languages they were using in their daily life. Then I looked at the cultural component. So for children, primary caregivers were asked things like, what is their connection to culture? They were asked if they participated in cultural events, if they consumed traditional foods, and who helped them with understanding their culture. And this is important when you think about what Amy just talked about with residential schools, because if we have grandparents who didn't have their culture, or parents that didn't have their culture, how is that impacting how we're passing that culture down? Are we revitalizing, and who's doing that revitalizing? Similar questions were asked of the youth and the adults, but in the adult survey, there was more about spirituality and what makes them balanced, which we didn't ask of the children, and youth didn't have as much in that area. So it's harder to examine what that would mean for children and youth. So really, here we're looking at children's connection to culture. 84.7% agreed or strongly agreed that traditional cultural events were important for a child's life, which is very similar to the 2008-10, where we had 87.1% who said that traditional culture was important for, or very important for, a child's well-being. So in the graph, you see that more than 1/4 of all children always or almost always participate in traditional activities, which included singing, drumming, dancing, at least once a week outside of school. I think we need a little bit more here because I'm not sure that those are the only 3 activities we consider cultural. And so the RHS may have to evolve the whole idea of what culture is, going from the land, connection to land. How many times are you on the land? What are you getting on the land? Are part of the things that weren't asked, but I think would then increase the amount of times they felt that it was important to children, youth, and adults. So who helps with understanding culture? 72.6% said it was grandparents. And then following that, 66 were parents, 66%, and 47.6% were teachers, daycare providers, or ECEs. So what that tells me is we have grandparents who lost or weren't around for their culture and may have reclaimed it themselves and are now trying to pass it on to the next generation. This is hugely important, and more research needs to look into this so we can see how they're doing that. What does it mean that they're passing on? Is it traditional teachings? Is it storytelling? Is it languages? We need to figure out what those pieces are. And then First Nations children connection to culture hasn't changed from the 2008 to 2010 RHS, but we have seen an increase in the number of children who speak a language at the intermediate and fluent levels. So this holds true again with adults and youth, but as we start to look at the connection to languages, we found that 88.7% of primary caregivers reported agreeing or strongly agreeing that learning some First Nations language is important. Now that's really good, but in all fairness, we're only at 88%, so what about that other 12? Language is one of the key pieces to culture, so if 12% aren't agreeing that this is very important, what happens to that 12%? And more needs to be looked at there. This is similar to the 2008-10 RHS, where we had 92.5 reporting that learning a First Nations language is important or somewhat important. The majority of children, 68%, had some knowledge of a First Nations language, with the majority understanding at least a few words, which is 62.6%, but less than 13% had fluency or intermediate knowledge of a First Nations language. Less than 13%. Only 1.9% said they couldn't speak a First Nations language in any way. So this is just children, so that's quite a few. That's 2% can't speak any First Nations language. The trend continues. When we look at the level of speaking ability, 62% could speak a few words. Less than 5% were fluent speakers. So that from up to the age of 11, only 5%. 3.5% were intermediate speakers, and just under 20% were basic speakers. So we are moving it up, but maybe we need more immersion. That's where the language revitalization people come in. They can do all of that work. So we also had, I want you to remember that in this survey you have 0 to 11, so there's a lot of children that haven't even started to speak. So don't take it to go, oh my gosh, because I think there is some room for those children that aren't speaking yet to learn a language. And I think it's important that we then look at what does that mean and where are we going to allow them to look at that, learn that language. So the vast majority of children have a knowledge of First Nations language, but the majority, 88%, use English as their daily language. So we're not seeing as many First Nations daily language speakers as we did in the past. It's 6.3% who speak a First Nations language on a daily basis and in their daily life. But in 2008, it was a little bit higher, but it was also not comparable because they changed the question and the response. So it's impossible to tell you that it's exactly the same because it was 25% and now it's down to 6.5. So looking at children's culture and language by their attendance at Aboriginal Head Start, which is supposed to, as one of its key principles, give you culture and language. This is one of my areas of study, and I'm really passionate about making sure Head Start gets everywhere and most children can be in it. You'll notice 40% have attended Aboriginal Head Start across Canada, and a significant higher portion of children who attended Aboriginal Head Start had some knowledge of a First Nations language, 76.9%. So Head Start's actually making a difference, or it appears to be making a difference in terms of bringing in language for the children. When we look at those children who never attended Head Start, 61.2% didn't have or had their language, but so we're looking at a significant difference. For children who attended Head Start, 34.3% always or almost always participated in cultural events, which is higher than those who didn't attend, which is 20.9%. So significantly more children who attend Head Start took part in traditional activities outside of school hours at least once a week. So you're looking at 21% of those who attend Head Start doing traditional activities versus 7.7% of children who never attended Head Start. So when we look at the youth, what we found was the majority of youth, or 80%, agreed or strongly agreed that traditional cultural activities were important in their lives. So again, we have 80%, but what about that other 20%? Why don't they believe that? And what does that mean for us? 20% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you start to look at the numbers, that's significant for the size of the population that was surveyed. The question and the response for this changed slightly between the 2008-10 RHS and now, where 85.7% reported that traditional cultural activities were very or somewhat important. Almost 20% reported always or almost always participating in community cultural events, and 51 said they participated sometimes. There's only 5.7% that said they never participated in cultural events. So that's really quite good. This is also similar to the 2008-10 RHS, where 74% always or almost always participated. The majority of youth, 92%, had eaten traditional foods in the last year. So I think that's significant too, because usually there's a reason why you're still able to get to your traditional foods, which is the land and the connection to land, which then brings you back to culture. When youth were asked who helps them to understand culture, most reported their grandparents, 63.6%. They were followed by parents at 54%, and 38% said school teachers. 3.6% of teens said that they had no one to help them understand their culture. So that's important and significant as well. Why is there no one there to help them? So the language used most often by youth in every day, 88.9% is English, which is similar to the children. So we're seeing English used more often, but that doesn't mean that we're not seeing First Nations language speakers or that they speak more than one language. So 3/4 of the youth, 75%, said that they had some knowledge of a First Nations language, but it's basic, it's a few words, which is about 56%, and 7.7% said they were fluent in a First Nations language. When they were talking about when they talked about what they spoke, so it was this, but they were also talking about that they had basic knowledge of different words in First Nations languages, and the majority, 75%, said that they had that. So youth who attended Head Start, 33.9% of our youth have attended a Head Start. 1/3, I'm so happy. Significantly higher, 84.5% of youth who attended Head Start had some knowledge of a First Nations language. And that's compared to those who never attended Head Start at 72.1%. And it's similar when you look at the connection to culture. 25% of youth who attended Head Start always or almost always participated in cultural events, compared to 17% who had never attended. So that's a good sign, and that Head Start's doing what we think it should be doing. When we look at the adults, 1/5 of adults always or almost always participate in cultural events. So about 20%, and it's similar to the 2008-10 RHS results, which were 20.7%. 21% said they rarely participate in cultural events. So 1/5 of our population at an adult level is not participating. So why are they not participating? The analysis didn't look at whether residential schools or other intergenerational trauma was affecting them and how that was affecting their attendance in cultural events. More than 1/3 of adults reported that cultural and traditional events contribute to their overall health, and 71% agree or strongly agree that traditional spirituality is important to them, which is slightly lower than the 79% in the 2008-10 RHS. But the vast majority of adults, 96.6%, had eaten traditional foods in the past year. So it's important to have some connections to culture, whatever it happens to be. So this graph just shows you what kinds of traditional foods they were consuming. Other traditional foods, according to the RHS, are things like bannock, I think it was wild rice, and there was one more, I think it was plants, other plant-like materials. So that, I mean, that's significant when you say 96% consume it. So for the cultural findings, about 1/5 of adults had consulted a traditional healer in the past year. So that's the same as the 2008-10 RHS, which was 21%, but it was higher than the 2002-2003 RHS, which was only 14%. So we are seeing a change. People are actually going back to traditional healing. And that more than 62% had reported that they had never consulted a traditional healer, but that's okay, because we're starting to see an increase. That means that we're starting to return to some of the other cultural pieces. The majority of adults had a very strong or somewhat strong sense of belonging to the local community, and 5% felt that they had a very weak sense of belonging to their community, meaning that we have very few adults feeling like they're not connected to their community. So when we looked at adults' connection to their language, the majority of adults had some knowledge of a First Nations language, 87%. So for adults with adults with knowledge of their First Nations language, 33.6% had a fluent understanding of the language, compared to less than 1% who didn't understand any First Nations language. So 1/3 understood, and only 1% didn't. So I think that's important. 30% could speak a First Nations language fluently, while 36.4% could speak just a few words. So I think that's also important, that we're having more language speakers, or at least we have more fluent language speakers than we have for a while. The majority of adults spoke English in their daily life, but now in the adult population, we had a significantly larger amount of people who could speak a First Nations language at 15.3%. So we have adults who can speak it, but the youth and the children aren't speaking it at the same levels. I think there's something to be looked at there. So I just wanted to say that we have to look at the colonial spaces and the inter and intra-generational traumas to understand why culture and language is not being revitalized and recouped in the way that we may have hoped. We also have to think about what other influences are affecting our culture and our languages, and who's picking up those cultures and languages in our communities, and who's moving them forward. So I think that there's a strong sense of, and strong and positive sense of belonging and identity for most of the respondents, but we need to figure out what that means and where they're getting it from. So talking to these communities yet again and delving maybe a little bit further into it in terms of culture and language so that we can understand how to revitalize, reclaim, and recapture our culture and languages. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Angela. Interesting, because as I was listening to you, I just had a conversation with my mom over the weekend, and I was texting her some, how do you say this, Mom? How do you say that, Mom? How do you say this, Mom? How do you say that? Because those stats just made me anxious, right?
You want to now learn it.
Yeah, and you're like, okay, the only way you're going to do it is if you get up and do it, right? And I have a fluent Mohawk speaker for a mother who speaks the old Mohawk, and I'm just like, I got to do this. Like, so yeah, thank you.
You can pass it to your kids.
Yes, thank you. And any questions? I'm here to, anybody? Oh.
I'm just really curious. I think that maybe from the Yukon, we're the only ones who include numbers about non-status Indigenous citizens. And when I look at the impacts of institutional racism, right now in the Yukon, we're seeing stories come out about people who attended public school, and now stories are coming out about sexual assault that targeted Indigenous students. So I think we're seeing that regardless of whether they went to residential school or public school, I think we're seeing a pattern where Indigenous students were seen as easy targets for predators. Are we looking at a future with the FNIGC and the Regional Health Survey where we will include the impacts of colonial impacts on all of us, regardless of whether we were excluded because of the racist policies of the Indian Act?
Mm-hmm. I really hope so. As I went through, and yes, these are bivariate analysis, just like Amy said, but when I started to look through, I had cut down the age groups and everything to kind of see, and depending on what age category you were in, there was differences there, and there was clearly differences in when they talked about different cultural events. But we don't have, did you go to an Indian hospital? How long did you stay there? That's a huge question that's now got to be somewhere added in. Kyla's looking at me going, no, please don't. But it's another section that we haven't talked about, and it's becoming bigger. It's the same as incarceration in prisons. We don't ask those people if they've been in prison, what does that mean? Because that's going to affect your culture and language as well. And we don't ask about, well, we do, but it wasn't analyzed. We do talk about, did you learn your language in school, or did you have a teacher that taught you? I think that's another piece that we need to start talking about. Head Start's great, but what about what happens once you're 6 and you're at school? And do we have methods and mechanisms in order to continue that culture and language practice?
Okay.
I'm just going to jump in because part of the question was directed at FNIGC and how we may include people as respondents. And FNIGC as an apolitical body will certainly never determine that, right? It will be First Nations communities and First Nations leadership as an exertion of sovereignty who will determine who respondents are in communities. Yukon, you do your own thing because you're already practicing that, right? So it won't be an FNIGC that decides that. It will be First Nations collectively, and through that leadership, we'll get direction.
I have a question to that. Can I ask that question? After he has a question. Right here.
Les stades, ils parlent beaucoup. Okay. Ce que moi je comprends dans ce que vous avez dit, quelques parents qui n'ont pas connu leurs parents ne le parlent pas. Okay. Oui, effectivement, ce sont quelque chose qui touche beaucoup dans les communautés. Parce que dans l'histoire du pensionnat, on parle des personnes qui sont décédées soit à l'hôpital ou dans un institut qu'on ne connaît même pas. Puis dans ma communauté, les informations circulent, puis ces personnes-là sont disparues de la liste. Ça, c'est des choses que j'ai eu connaissance des personnes qui ont été dans un pensionnat, des pensionnaires. L'autre point que je trouvais ça intéressant, c'est les parents, qui ont été dans le programme, pas dans le programme, mais c'est des ex-pensionnats. Oui, il y a eu des impacts au niveau de l'intergénérationnel. Mais ce que je peux vous dire aujourd'hui, c'est que c'est encore présent. Il y a un bout de travail qui n'a pas été fait sur ce côté-là. Parce que ces jeunes-là, ils ont été déracinés les parents ont été déracinés. Puis nos jeunes aujourd'hui, ils ont été déracinés de nos vies. Puis ils ont été dans des pavillons. Nous, on a eu un pavillon de Notre-Dame-le-Vico. Donc ça a toujours été un prêtre qui l'a occupé. Tu sais, ce sont je pense que j'en ai entendu parler aussi dans le coin de l'Ouest, puis un peu partout, là. Fait que nous aussi, on fait partie de ces jeunes-là là, qui en parlent aujourd'hui, là. Ils en parlent ouvertement, puis fort. Puis ils vivent encore cette pression-là. Nous, en tant que parents, nous autres aussi, on a été dans le pensionnat. Puis on fait en sorte de travailler beaucoup au niveau de la langue, au niveau de la culture. Moi, je ne parle ma langue. Je peux vous dire que Chimigwet Sumag Denam Egibijak Kena Menendani Numa Endetaman Gegun Anamujigadek. Moi, je ne parle ma langue. Je ne l'ai pas perdu. J'ai été au pensionnat. J'ai été assimilé à ça. Quelques années, je l'ai perdu, mais je l'ai repris. Puis si nos jeunes, ils ne parlent pas cette langue-là, il faut se réadapter à cette langue-là. Je trouve ça toujours intéressant de voir que le travail partout dans les communautés se fasse et que les informations circulent. C'est tout le temps intéressant. Fait que pour l'instant, c'est ça que j'avais à vous dire. Mais si j'ai d'autres points, je vais intervenir. Merci.
This is going to be somewhat of a recap. First of all, it's more of a testimonial and a comment on the presentation that's just been made, which he found extremely interesting. First, he would like to identify as a survivor of the residential school system who speaks fluently his own language today. And he is very recognizant of the importance of language, of culture particularly, and the attachment that this has to the land, the territory. However, there's a lot of data, information, individuals who are being missed in the survey. In particular, perhaps those who fell into the hospital system or the justice system or victims of the scoop in the 60s, which perhaps are not being covered in this particular data set. But he's very, very pleased to see that the word is getting out, that communities are taking charge, that this is a bottom-up exercise, not community-based. It's not being imposed from anywhere. And more has to be done, of course, but very pleased with the progress in charge. I know I've missed a few little pieces here and there, but there you are. Miguel.
Concernant pour le système de centre jeunesse, la DPJ, les signalements, ça c'est un autre impact aussi au niveau de l'intergénérationnel. Ces jeunes-là sont défavorisés, ok, sont comme arrachés quand ils ont des enfants. Ils en pleurent beaucoup, puis ils comptent le système aujourd'hui. Ils n'en veulent pas. Par chez nous, ils n'en veulent pas, mais nous, par contre, on doit trouver des solutions. On a les moyens, mais ces jeunes-là, ils veulent vraiment pas le système des PJ. Par contre, mais on va quand même continuer, nous autres, sur cette avenue-là, d'avoir des pistes de solutions soit par nos aînés, par les travailleurs sociaux de première ligne. Donc, il y a des avenues. Merci.
Another aspect, of course, of where they're falling through the cracks is with the youth services systems, which are completely rejected out of hand in his area, northern Quebec, and they are coming up with their own solutions, elders, traditional folk ways, but the youth that have fallen into the youth protection, quote-unquote, system, perpetuate the intergenerational negative effects of all of this. And they can't help it when the system is imposed on them, but they do everything they can to try to avoid it, to find their own in-house solutions. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Just a quick question to recap the first question. Is there a way that's someone can, that maybe not be in a leadership position or can write to the organization to give their feedback on what areas that they might want to study or things that they might think are missing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the people that we work with across the country are always encouraged to give us that feedback. The FNIGC plays a particular role. As I said, the leadership really does come from First Nations communities, First Nations leadership, and we get direction to follow it. But as technical experts, and therefore charged with giving advice from that technical expertise, we do want to hear this from people, so from respondents in communities, certainly from people doing the work, from researchers, from government partners. We want to hear that, and then from that advisory perspective, we would certainly put that out as again an apolitical perspective, but to say here are the things methodologically we might want to consider. Here are the things we might want to consider from a research perspective. I certainly have an interest in what Christine is saying personally, and as a researcher, my mind goes in that direction. So there is plenty of opportunity for people to say, here's how we think that this can improve, and we would work with people across the country to have that conversation. As I said earlier today, the bar has been continually raised over the years, and refinements have been made, and you have driven those refinements. So yes, please tell us what you think.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more questions that I can?
Can I just build upon that before?
Sure, absolutely.
One of the things that I strongly believe is the government has done a great job of dividing Indigenous people across Canada. So as soon as you leave the reserve, you're no longer the same Indigenous person you were just a minute ago when you were on the res. So I think we've got to stop doing this on and off business or the status, non-status business. If you're connected to your community, regardless of where you reside, we should be doing the RHS. It shouldn't matter if you're on or off reserve. It'll be different, but I think we still need them.
Okay, any other questions before we take a break?
Just very quickly, I do want to say that the 6, or I think you had 8 components in regards to the effects that it had on the language. I do want to tell you that I believe you're right on in regards to those components. And I really believe that the hospital component is another factor that the government is going to face in a few years, just like they are now facing the 60 scoops. as a former survivor of residential school, I did not learn my language. However, I am working with the younger generation in regards to revitalization of language. And I can't emphasize how strongly that language really, in regards to our culture, on the land programs are so important because we have that connection and it does strengthen the spirit. And I can see younger people now that are learning and eager about learning their language, how proud they are as they grow up. And I want to say that I really appreciated your presentation and encourage you to keep doing the work. And it's so nice, it gives me pride just to see an Aboriginal person do this. And this is why I just feel that it's so important that you continue to encourage the key component to our link that's being broken. Because without our language, our culture is not there. You don't feel so passionate about our culture. So I thank you so much.
Thank you. And I want to say that as part of my work, I'm newly appointed to U of T, and we just created a Masters of Public Health program in Indigenous Health, so my little plug for work. But when I created the courses for that Masters program, every one of them has a land-based component. So whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, students will actually see why Indigenous people feel the land is so important to them. And I think that's important to be starting to carry on to non-Indigenous people. They've heard it from us, but now they have to feel it and see it. And I think that's part of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions, unless someone has one burning question before we go to break. Okay, well, thank you so much, Angela. Thank you very much. We are going to take a 15-minute break. We will be back here at, let's say, 10:02, or I'll give you 5:02. 5:02.